I was desperate for a cheaper place to live when I found the ad. It felt like fate. $500 a month for a fully furnished apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Mia, the woman who posted the ad, seemed shy but polite when we met. She was soft-spoken and avoided eye contact, but there was something about her that felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at the time, just a feeling. The apartment itself was pristine, almost too perfect. No clutter, no personal items, no signs that anyone had lived there for long. It felt sterile, like a stage set for a catalog photo. I asked Mia about her last roommate, and her reaction made me pause. For a split second, she looked uncomfortable. "She left in a hurry," Mia said quietly, glancing toward a box in the corner of the room. "Didn't even take all her stuff." The box was filled with random items. A few books, a sweater, some toiletries. It made me wonder what kind of person could just abandon everything like that, but I didn't want to push Mia for details. After all, I was getting an incredible deal. I moved in the following weekend, excited to finally save some money. At first, things seemed fine. Mia kept to herself. She had a routine, leaving early in the morning and coming back late at night. I figured she had a demanding job and didn't think much of it, but then the little things started happening. One night, I woke up to the sound of crying. It was soft, muffled, and coming from Mia's room. I got up, knocked on her door, and called out to her. The crying stopped abruptly, and no one answered. The next morning, when I asked her about it, she just smiled, this small, strange smile, and said, "You must have been dreaming." Then there were the lights. I'd turned them off before going to bed, only to find them on in the morning. My keys ended up in places I'd never put them, and objects around the apartment seemed to move on their own. The smell was the worst. It came and went, faint but distinct, like rust or something metallic. No matter how much I cleaned, I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Things finally escalated one evening when I came home early from work. I walked into the apartment and found Mia standing in the living room staring at the wall. She didn't even notice me at first. She was whispering something soft, repetitive, and in a language I didn't recognize. "Mia?" I said cautiously. She turned slowly, her eyes wide and blank, like she wasn't all there. "You shouldn't be here," she said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. Then she brushed past me and left the apartment without another word. That was the moment I knew something was seriously wrong. The next day, I called the landlord to ask about the apartment's history. What they told me made my blood run cold. Mia wasn't on the lease. In fact, she had no right to be living there at all. The last official tenant, a young woman, had disappeared months ago under mysterious circumstances. Her belongings, the ones Mia claimed were left behind in a hurry, had been abandoned after her disappearance. No one knew what happened to her. I didn't wait to find out what Mia's connection to the missing tenant was. I packed what I could and left that night. I've never been back, and I never want to know what might have happened if I'd stayed any longer. It started with an ad that seemed completely harmless. Administrative assistant needed, flexible hours, competitive pay, no experience required. I'd been job hunting for weeks, and this sounded perfect. The ad was posted by someone named Mr. Reynolds. His email responses were polite, even professional. He explained that the job would involve organizing files and running errands for a small business he was starting. The interview would take place at his office, which was located in an older part of town that I didn't know well. When I arrived, the building gave me pause. It was an old, run-down office complex on the edge of a mostly industrial area. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the few cars there looked like they hadn't moved in years. The windows on the upper floors were dark, and the whole place had this heavy, oppressive silence, like no one had worked there in a long time. Still, I was desperate for a job, so I pushed my unease aside and went in. The lobby was dingy, with faded carpet and a musty smell that reminded me of an attic. A flickering fluorescent light overhead didn't help my nerves. Mr. Reynolds was waiting for me in a small office on the second floor. He looked ordinary enough, middle-aged, average build, wearing a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt, but there was something about him that made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered a little too long, or how his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The interview started normally. He asked me about my availability and my experience, then, about 10 minutes in, his questions started to get weird. "Are you living alone right now?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. The question caught me off guard. "No," I lied. "I live with a roommate." He nodded, his eyes narrowing like he didn't believe me. "That's good. It's always safer to have someone around." I tried to steer the conversation back to the job, but his next question made my stomach drop. Do you have any family in the area? Someone who would miss you if you went away for a while? The way he said it was casual, like it was just part of the interview, but his tone sent a chill down my spine. I forced a laugh and said, "Of course, my family is very close." Something in his expression shifted. He leaned back in his chair and smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was predatory. "That's good to hear," he said. I made up an excuse to end the interview quickly and got out of there as fast as I could. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I got home, I decided to do some digging. A quick search of the building's address showed that the office complex had been mostly abandoned for years. There were no businesses registered to anyone named Mr. Reynolds. I reported the ad to Craigslist and the police, but nothing ever came of it. To this day, I wonder how many people he interviewed before me, and if they all made it out. I just moved into my first apartment and was on a tight budget, so I turned to Craigslist for cheap furniture. That's how I found the ad for a beautiful, antique dresser. The pictures made it look perfect. Ornate carvings, a deep polished wood finish, and a mirror attached to the top. Best of all, the seller was only asking $50. The seller, an older man named Henry, sounded pleasant over the phone. He said the dresser had belonged to his late wife, and that he needed to clear out some things. When I went to pick it up, his house felt cold and empty, almost as if no one had lived there in years. Henry was waiting for me on the porch. He was a frail man in his 70s, with sunken eyes and a weary expression. As we made small talk, I couldn't help but notice the sadness in his voice when he mentioned his wife. He said she'd passed away a year ago, and that the dresser had been her favorite piece of furniture. "It's beautiful," I told him, running my fingers over the smooth wood. "It is," he said quietly. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "She always said it shouldn't leave this house." That should have been my first clue, but I dismissed it as sentimentality. I handed him the money, loaded the dresser into my car, and drove home. The first few days, nothing unusual happened. The dresser looked perfect in my bedroom, and I was thrilled with my purchase. But then, strange things started to happen. It began with the mirror. Late at night, I'd catch glimpses of movement in its reflection, shadows darting just out of view. At first, I thought it was my imagination or the play of light from passing cars. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw something that froze me in place. In the mirror, I could see a woman standing behind me. She was blurry, like a smudge on the glass, but her shape was unmistakable. Long hair, a flowing dress. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing night. I started hearing soft whispers when I was alone in the room, just quiet enough that I couldn't make out the words. The smell of roses, faint but distinct, would suddenly fill the air, even though I didn't own any flowers. The final straw came one night when I woke up to the sound of scraping. The dresser was moving, just an inch or two, but enough to make a sound as its legs dragged against the floor. Terrified, I called a friend to come over. When I told her about the dresser and the strange things I'd been experiencing, she suggested getting rid of it immediately. The next day, I called Henry to ask if he wanted it back. His response chilled me to the bone. "I told you it shouldn't leave this house," he said, his voice trembling. "She's angry." That night, I left the dresser by the curb with a free sign taped to it. I didn't care if someone else took it, I just wanted it gone. When I checked the next morning, it was gone. But for weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something into my home that I couldn't fully get rid of. It all started with an ad for a used laptop. I needed one for work, and this was a great deal. $200 for a barely used MacBook. The seller claimed he was upgrading to a newer model and just wanted to get rid of it quickly. I reached out, and the man, who called himself Tom, replied almost immediately. He seemed friendly and polite, and after a bit of back and forth, we agreed to meet in a public place, a coffee shop downtown. As a woman, I've always been cautious about meeting strangers from online ads, so I made sure it was during the day in a crowded spot. When I got there, Tom was already waiting. He was a clean-cut guy in his 30s, wearing a button-down shirt and glasses. He smiled warmly when he saw me and handed me the laptop. It looked exactly like the pictures in the ad, practically brand new. We chatted briefly while I inspected it. He seemed normal, even charming, and when I handed over the cash, he thanked me and wished me a good day. Nothing about the interaction set off any alarms. But later that night, as I was setting up the laptop, I noticed something strange. There was a small, almost invisible hole near the screen's bezel. I thought it was just a scratch at first, but when I looked closer, I realized it was a tiny camera lens. My stomach dropped. I'd heard of horror stories about people planting hidden cameras in devices to spy on unsuspecting victims. I immediately turned the laptop off and put it in a drawer, planning to deal with it the next day. That's when the messages started. The first one came around midnight. It was a text from an unknown number. "Do you like the laptop?" My heart raced as I stared at the screen. I hadn't given my phone number to Tom, or at least I didn't think I had. Maybe he'd found it through the Craigslist ad? I decided to ignore it, thinking it was a coincidence. Then came the next message. "You look so peaceful when you sleep." I froze. The blood drained from my face as I realized he had been watching me. Somehow, he was already inside my life, and I hadn't even noticed. Terrified, I called the police and explained the situation. They told me to stop using the laptop immediately and bring it in for evidence. An officer came to my apartment to check for anything else suspicious, but nothing seemed out of place. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every shadow felt like a threat. I kept my phone close and jumped at every notification, expecting another message. The next day, the police confirmed my worst fears. The laptop had been modified with hidden spyware, and the camera had been streaming directly to a private server. But what made my skin crawl was what they found on that server. Hundreds of video files, each one labeled with a woman's name and the date of her purchase. He'd done this before. I never heard from Tom again, and the police said they were investigating, but they didn't seem hopeful about catching him. To this day, I don't know if he's still out there, watching someone else through a device they thought was safe. Now, every time I buy something secondhand, I check every inch of it, and I never forget the lesson I learned that day. Sometimes, the deal of a lifetime comes with a price you can't afford to pay. I was in a bind and needed a place fast. My lease was up, and I'd procrastinated too long to find a new apartment. That's when I saw the ad on Craigslist. Spacious room for rent, $400/month, utilities included. It seemed like a lifesaver. The landlord was a guy named Richard. He sounded normal enough over the phone, friendly, laid back, and eager to rent the room. He said he was looking for someone quiet and responsible, which worked for me. We agreed to meet at the house later that evening, so I could see the place. When I arrived, the house looked a little run down but livable, paint peeling on the siding, a few missing shingles on the roof. It was tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of place that felt isolated but safe. Richard was waiting on the porch, a man in his late 40s with a receding hairline and an easy smile. He gave me a quick tour of the house, pointing out the shared kitchen and living room. The room for rent was upstairs, and it was bigger than I expected. There was already a bed and dresser inside, which he said I could use for free. "Look," he said as we went back downstairs, "I've had bad luck with tenants in the past, so I just asked for first month's rent up front and a security deposit. No lease or anything. It's month to month, simple and flexible." I should have been suspicious, but I was desperate. The price was unbeatable, and I needed a place immediately. I handed over the cash and moved in the next day. At first, everything was fine. Richard mostly kept to himself, spending most of his time in the basement. He'd come upstairs occasionally to watch TV or cook, but he didn't bother me, and I didn't bother him. But after about a week, I started noticing strange things. It began with noises. Late at night, I'd hear creaking floorboards and soft thuds coming from the hallway outside my room. The first time, I assumed it was Richard, but when I mentioned it the next morning, he just laughed and said, "This old house makes a lot of noise. You'll get used to it." Then, I noticed the locks. Every door in the house had a deadbolt on the outside, even my bedroom door. I asked Richard about it, and he shrugged. The last tenant was paranoid. He put those on. I never got around to taking them off. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. The final straw came late one night. I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I saw it. Richard standing in the doorway staring at me. "What are you doing?" I shouted, sitting up in bed. He didn't answer. He just stood there for a moment, then backed out and closed the door. I locked it and stayed awake the rest of the night, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I confronted him. He gave me a sheepish smile and said, "Sorry about that. I thought I heard something and wanted to make sure you were okay." I knew I had to leave, but I didn't want to raise his suspicions. That afternoon, I packed up my essentials and told him I'd be staying with a friend for a few days. He looked disappointed but didn't argue. A week later, I saw a news article that made my blood run cold. Richard had been arrested after police discovered the remains of 2 people buried in the backyard. One of them was his last tenant. I still can't believe how close I came to being his next victim. Now, every time I look for a place to live, I think about that house and the man who rented me that room, and I'm reminded that some deals are too good to be true. Craigslist offers endless opportunities for finding great deals and new connections, but as these stories show, it can also be a gateway to danger. Whether it's a too good to be true rental, a suspicious job posting, or a harmless-looking piece of furniture, you never really know what you're inviting into your life. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends. Who knows? You might just save someone from their own Craigslist horror story. And remember, sometimes the real monsters are just a click away.